Imagine holding a piece of paper that could end the world, not through magic or mystery, but through mathematics so elegant, so terrifyingly simple, that once written, it could never be unwritten. This is the story of such a letter. In the summer of 1939, two men drove through Long Island searching for a hidden cottage. They carried with them knowledge that would reshape civilization itself. Within weeks, their words would reach the President of the United States. Within years, entire cities would vanish in light, brighter than the sun. This is not a tale of villains and heroes. It is something more complex, more human. It is the story of how discovery becomes destiny, how curiosity transforms into catastrophe, and how a single equation, beautiful in its brevity, became the most consequential arrangement of symbols ever conceived. The atomic age began with a signature. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The heat that July day was oppressive, the kind that makes Long Island's summer roads shimmer like water. Leo Szilard sat beside Eugene Wigner in a borrowed Dodge sedan, both men sweating through their shirts, both carrying a secret that weighed heavier than any physical burden. They were looking for a cottage, but more than that, they were looking for Albert Einstein. Einstein had a way of disappearing. The world's most famous scientist, the man whose wild hair and twinkling eyes had become synonymous with genius itself, preferred quiet summers away from Princeton's academic intensity. He would retreat to modest rented cottages where he could sail small boats and think big thoughts. But he never bothered to remember exactly where these cottages were. Addresses, he felt, were details better left to others. Szilard and Wigner had an address, but it was wrong. They drove through the sticky afternoon, stopping at general stores and gas stations, asking if anyone had seen the famous professor. Can you picture it? Two European physicists with thick accents, their English still uncertain, trying to explain they needed to find Einstein, urgently. They couldn't say why. The shopkeepers must have thought them mad. They were about to give up, when Wigner suggested one more inquiry. A young boy on a bicycle pointed them toward Old Grove Road in Peconic. There, behind a screen of trees, they found him. Einstein answered the door in worn trousers and a rumpled shirt, his feet bare against the summer heat. He was 50 years old that summer, his face more lined than in the famous photographs, but his eyes still held that peculiar mixture of kindness and cosmic understanding. He invited them in without ceremony, as if brilliant physicists appeared at his door every afternoon. What Szilard had to tell him would end Einstein's peaceful summer forever. 6 months earlier, in December of 1938, two German chemists named Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had split the uranium atom. Not on purpose exactly. They had been bombarding uranium with neutrons, expecting to create slightly heavier elements. Instead, their chemistry revealed something impossible: barium. An element only about half the size of uranium. The atom had broken in half. Lise Meitner, exiled in Sweden, had worked out what this meant. When uranium split, it released energy. Not ordinary energy, but energy drawn from Einstein's own equation, the famous E=mc². The equation said that mass and energy were interchangeable, that matter itself was frozen energy waiting to be released. When an atom split, a tiny amount of mass disappeared, converted directly into energy according to that deceptively simple formula, and the amounts were staggering. Szilard explained this to Einstein as they sat in the modest cottage. One uranium atom splitting released roughly 200 million electron volts. That number meant little by itself, so Szilard made it concrete. A single kilogram of uranium, if all its atoms could be induced to split, would release energy equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. Einstein's response was simple, shocked. I never thought of that. Here was the extraordinary thing. Einstein had given the world the equation in 1905, 34 years earlier, he had shown that energy and mass were two forms of the same thing, that the universe ran on conversions between them. Stars burned by converting mass to energy. Every physical process involved this exchange at some level. But Einstein, for all his genius, had never imagined that humans might deliberately trigger such conversions on a practical scale. The atom's fortress seemed too strong. The energy inside seemed permanently locked away. Meitner's calculations had shattered that assumption, and Szilard, sitting in Einstein's cottage, had seen something even more profound. He had realized that when uranium split, it didn't just release energy, it also released neutrons, typically 2 or 3 per fission. Those neutrons could strike other uranium atoms, splitting them in turn. Each of those atoms would release more neutrons, which would split more atoms, which would release more neutrons. A chain reaction. Consider what this meant. One atom splits, releasing 2 neutrons. Those 2 split 2 more atoms, releasing 4 neutrons. Those 4 split 4 atoms, releasing 8 neutrons. The progression was exponential, doubling with each generation. In a large enough mass of uranium, with neutrons moving at fantastic speeds, the entire sequence could unfold in millionths of a second. The explosion would be like nothing humanity had ever created. Szilard had actually conceived this idea years earlier. In 1933, standing at a traffic light in London, he had been thinking about atomic energy, about whether the nucleus might somehow be coaxed into releasing its vast stores. The light changed from red to green, and in that moment, the chain reaction concept crystallized in his mind. Neutrons splitting atoms like dominoes falling through matter. He saw it complete, terrifying, inevitable. He had even filed a patent on the concept, assigning it to the British Admiralty to keep it secret. But that was before anyone knew uranium could actually fission. That was before Hahn's chemistry proved physics had misunderstood the atom's behavior. Now, in July of 1939, the abstract possibility had become concrete reality, and Germany knew about it. This was what brought Szilard to Einstein's door. Not just the physics, but the politics. Both men were refugees, Jews who had fled European persecution. They understood what Hitler represented in ways many Americans still did not. They knew that German physicists, some of the finest minds in the world, would immediately recognize fission's potential. They knew that Germany controlled Czechoslovakia, which meant Germany controlled the uranium mines at Joachimsthal. But there was something even more troubling. The richest uranium deposits in the world lay in Belgian Congo. Tons of high-grade uranium ore sat in warehouses in Belgium, refined and ready for use. If Germany invaded Belgium, if the Nazis seized that uranium, they would have everything needed to pursue a weapon. Szilard explained all this to Einstein. The physics, the politics, the terrifying convergence of discovery and destiny. He explained that someone needed to warn the Belgian government to secure their uranium. Someone needed to alert the American government that a new type of weapon was possible. Someone whose name carried weight, whose authority was unquestioned. Someone like Albert Einstein. Einstein listened, his expression growing graver. He was a pacifist by deep conviction. He had spoken out against war, against weapons, against the very idea of nations solving disputes through violence. But he was also a realist. He understood that Hitler's Germany represented something unprecedented, a regime willing to pursue domination without moral restraint. If such a regime obtained atomic weapons first, obtained them alone, the consequences would be unthinkable. Einstein agreed to help. They drafted a letter that afternoon, but Szilard found it too cautious, too abstract. He wanted something stronger, more direct. He wanted a letter that would jolt the American government into action. So they agreed to try again. Szilard would work on a new draft, and they would meet once more to finalize the text. On August 2nd, 1939, Szilard returned to Long Island, this time with Edward Teller driving. They found Einstein again, and this time the letter they crafted was different, stronger, more urgent. It began with a careful explanation of the new physics. Some recent work by E. Fermi and L. Szilard, which has been communicated to me in manuscript, leads me to expect that the element uranium may be turned into a new and important source of energy in the immediate future. Then came the possibility of weapons. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. The letter warned that Germany had stopped selling uranium from Czechoslovakian mines. It noted that the son of the German Undersecretary of State had attached himself to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute where fission research was ongoing. It urged Roosevelt to secure uranium ore, to support American research, to take the threat seriously. And then came the crucial sentence, the one that transformed physics into policy. A single bomb of this type, carried by boat and exploded in a port, might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. Einstein signed it, just his name, in that distinctive handwriting. But that signature carried the weight of the 20th century's greatest scientific mind. That signature turned an abstract warning into something the President of the United States could not ignore, or so they hoped. The letter needed a delivery mechanism. You couldn't simply mail such a document to the White House and expect it to reach Roosevelt's desk. Szilard enlisted Alexander Sachs, a banker and economist who had Roosevelt's ear, to deliver the message personally. Sachs agreed, taking the letter with him when he returned to Washington. And then came silence. Days passed, weeks passed. August became September, and on the first day of that month, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. And still the letter sat, waiting for Roosevelt's attention. Sachs finally secured a meeting on October 11th, more than 2 months after Einstein had signed the letter. He arrived at the White House with the document and supporting materials, determined to make Roosevelt understand the stakes. But the president was distracted, preoccupied with the war in Europe, with Japan's aggression in China, with 100 immediate crises demanding immediate attention. Sachs spent the evening explaining the physics, the implications, the dangers. Roosevelt listened politely, but without conviction. The meeting ended inconclusively. Sachs left the White House uncertain whether his message had penetrated at all. But that night, Sachs had an inspiration. The next morning he requested another meeting. When Roosevelt admitted him, Sachs told him a story. He reminded the president of a young American inventor who had written to Napoleon, offering a fleet of ships powered by steam rather than sail, ships that could move in any weather, regardless of wind. Napoleon, focused on immediate concerns, dismissed the idea. Years later, those steam-powered ships helped defeat France. Roosevelt got the point immediately. "Alex," he said, "what you are after is to see that the Nazis don't blow us up." "Precisely," Sachs replied. Roosevelt called in his aide, General Edwin Parr Watson. He handed him Einstein's letter and said, "Parr, this requires action." With those words, the machinery of government began to move. Roosevelt established what became known as the Uranium Committee, tasked with investigating the feasibility of atomic weapons. The initial budget was modest, just $6,000 for purchasing graphite and uranium to conduct basic experiments. No one yet understood the true scale of what would be required, but the seed had been planted. Einstein's equation, written in 1905 as an abstract description of how the universe works, had become a blueprint for weapons. The patent clerk who had reimagined space and time had, without intending it, shown humanity how to release the fire at matter's heart. Einstein himself would later say it was his one great mistake, that signing the letter had been an error he regretted more than any other action in his life. But consider the alternatives. If Einstein had refused, if he had maintained his pacifist stance absolutely, would Germany have obtained atomic weapons first? Would Hitler, facing defeat, have hesitated to use them? We cannot know. History offers no controlled experiments, no way to test what might have been. We know only what was. What was? A desperate drive through summer heat to find a hidden cottage. What was? A letter written twice because the stakes were too high for timidity. What was? A signature that launched what would become the largest scientific military project in human history. A $2 billion gamble employing 600,000 Americans to build 3 atomic bombs. 3 bombs. 2 would fall on Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands in seconds. The 3rd would be tested in the New Mexico desert, turning sand to radioactive glass and announcing to the world that physics had fundamentally altered the nature of war, of politics, of existence itself. But that July afternoon in 1939, none of that had happened yet. Einstein signed the letter in his quiet cottage, still unaware of what his equation would ultimately mean. Szilard carried it away, hoping it would convince a president to take action. 2 refugee physicists, driven by the knowledge that silence might give Hitler the ultimate weapon, had set in motion forces they could not control. The atomic age had begun, not with an explosion but with a signature, not in a laboratory but in a modest summer cottage, not through grand planning but through desperate improvisation. And the letter, that piece of paper Einstein called his greatest mistake, remains. It rests now in the Roosevelt Library at Hyde Park, preserved behind glass. Visitors can see Einstein's handwriting, can read the careful warning about extremely powerful bombs. They can see the exact moment when theoretical physics became practical horror, when an equation transformed into engineering. The letter changed nothing and everything. Nuclear fission would have been discovered regardless of Einstein's warning. The physics was known, published in scientific journals worldwide before anyone thought to classify it as secret. German scientists knew it, Japanese scientists knew it, Soviet scientists knew it. The bomb was coming. But Einstein's letter ensured that America would pursue the bomb as well. It guaranteed that Hitler would not obtain the weapon alone, unopposed. It set in motion the Manhattan Project, which would race across 3 continents, gathering uranium and plutonium and the finest scientific minds the world had ever assembled. Consider the weight of that choice. To warn of a weapon you hope will never exist. To advocate for its creation because you fear the alternative more. To use your fame, your authority, your moral standing to convince a nation to build instruments of annihilation. This was Einstein's burden. A patent clerk turned professor turned cultural icon, remembered now not only for revealing the universe's deepest workings but for showing how those workings could be weaponized. The man who spent his later years advocating for peace, for nuclear disarmament, for international cooperation, began that journey by urging a president toward the atom's terrible fire. The letter exists. You can see it, touch the glass that protects it, contemplate the words that launch so much, and when you do, remember that it represents something more than history. It represents the eternal dilemma of knowledge itself. Once understood, can discovery be unlearned? Once possible, can invention be refused? Once conceived, can catastrophe be avoided? Einstein thought not. He signed the letter believing that silence would not stop the bomb but merely ensure it was built by those who would use it without hesitation. He chose the lesser evil, or what he hoped was the lesser evil, and spent his remaining years wondering if he had chosen correctly. The cottage on Old Grove Road still stands. The roads Szilard and Wigner drove that desperate afternoon still carry traffic. The ordinary places where extraordinary history unfolds persist, largely unmarked, barely remembered. But the letter remains, and the bombs it helped create remain, thousands of them, waiting in silos and submarines, a permanent inheritance from the summer day when physics became policy and an equation became an arsenal. This is where the story begins, with a signature on a summer afternoon, with two frightened physicists and one reluctant genius, with a warning that became a weapon, and a hope that became a horror, and an equation that could never be unwritten once conceived. The atomic age opened not with thunder, but with pen on paper, not in flame, but in ink, and once begun, it could never be stopped, only endured, only survived, only integrated into the permanent fabric of human existence. The letter that changed everything rests in its archive, silent now, its work complete. But the world it created continues, still wrestling with the knowledge that paper made real, still living with the fire that signature unleashed. The story of how we learn to split the atom begins not in a laboratory, but on a snowy path in Sweden, with a woman calculating the end of the world on the back of an envelope. Lise Meitner was 60 years old in December of 1938, and she had just become a refugee. For 30 years she had worked in Berlin, one of the 20th century's most brilliant physicists, collaborating with Otto Hahn on experiments that probed the atomic nucleus. But Meitner was Jewish, and by 1938 that meant she was no longer safe in Germany. She had fled in July, crossing the border with 10 marks in her pocket and a diamond ring given by Hahn's wife, hidden in case she needed to bribe guards. No luggage, no documents beyond a passport soon to be invalid. She carried with her something far more valuable than possessions, knowledge of experiments that would reshape physics itself. By December, Meitner was in Sweden, working at a physics institute but feeling isolated, cut off from the work that had defined her life. Then came Hahn's letter. He wrote to her in confusion, almost embarrassment. His latest experiment had produced results that made no chemical sense. He had bombarded uranium with neutrons, expecting to create heavier elements. Instead, his chemistry insisted he had created barium. Barium, an element with an atomic weight of roughly 137. Uranium had an atomic weight of 238. Somehow, impossibly, more than a third of the uranium atom had vanished. Hahn knew his chemistry was correct. He had tested and retested, checked and rechecked, but he could not explain what his results meant. So he wrote to Meitner, the physicist who had worked alongside him for decades, hoping she could make sense of the impossible. That Christmas, Meitner's nephew Otto Frisch visited her in the Swedish town of Kungälv. Frisch was also a physicist, working in Copenhagen with Niels Bohr. On a winter walk through snow-covered woods, Meitner showed him Hahn's letter and shared her suspicions. Picture this moment. Two people walking through Swedish winter, their breath visible in cold air, discussing an experiment conducted hundreds of miles away. Meitner pulled out paper and began calculating as they walked. The uranium atom had not lost a third of its mass. It had split in two. Fission, they would come to call it, borrowing the term from biology, from the way cells divide. But splitting the atom meant something profound, something that made them stop walking altogether. When uranium divided into two smaller atoms, the sum of those products weighed slightly less than the original uranium. A tiny amount of mass had disappeared, and Einstein's equation said that vanished mass had to become energy. Meitner calculated right there, on that snowy path, using the back of an envelope and a pencil. One uranium atom splitting would release approximately 200 million electron volts. 200 million. From one atom. Consider what this number represents. A single uranium atom is unimaginably small. A gram of uranium contains approximately 2.5 billion trillion atoms. If you could somehow induce all of them to split, releasing 200 million electron volts each, that single gram would release energy equivalent to roughly 20 tons of TNT. From 1 gram, the mass of a paperclip. Frisch and Meitner understood immediately what this meant. They were looking at an energy source unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. More than that, They were looking at a potential weapon. They finished their walk in troubled silence, their minds racing with implications. Frisch returned to Copenhagen and told Niels Bohr, who was preparing to sail to America for a conference. Bohr grasped the significance instantly. He took the news with him across the Atlantic, and within weeks, every major physics laboratory in the world was attempting to replicate Hahn's experiment. They all succeeded. You see, the remarkable thing about fission was that it required no exotic equipment, no rare materials, no techniques beyond what any competent laboratory possessed. Uranium was available. Neutron sources were available. The experimental setup was straightforward. By February of 1939, physicists at Columbia University, at Berkeley, at laboratories across America and Europe and Japan had all confirmed it. Uranium split. The atom's heart could be broken. But let me take you back to Otto Hahn, still in Berlin, still struggling to understand what his chemistry had revealed. Hahn was not a Jewish refugee. He was a respected German scientist who had chosen to remain in his homeland despite the regime he privately despised. When he conducted the experiment that proved fission, his hands were literally shaking. He knew what he was seeing. He knew it violated everything physicists thought they understood about atomic nuclei. The nucleus was supposed to be inviolable, held together by forces so powerful that nothing could tear it apart. Yet his chemistry insisted the impossible had occurred. Hahn wrote to Meitner partly from confusion, but also from something deeper. He was asking her to validate a discovery he feared making alone. He was asking her to share the burden of knowledge that could not be unlearned. And Meitner, walking through Swedish snow, understood exactly what that burden meant. There was another scientist who had glimpsed this truth earlier but missed its significance. Enrico Fermi, the Italian physicist who would later build the world's first nuclear reactor, had been bombarding uranium with neutrons since 1934. He had created new radioactive substances and assumed he was making elements heavier than uranium, elements that had never existed before. He was wrong. He had split uranium 4 years before Hahn, but Fermi's physics told him such splitting was impossible, so he interpreted his results differently. He convinced himself he was creating new elements rather than breaking existing ones. His own theoretical understanding had blinded him to what his experiments revealed. This is one of science's curious truths. Sometimes our theories obscure reality rather than illuminating it. Fermi was too good a physicist, too confident in the nucleus's stability, to recognize that he had shattered it. He would realize his error only after Hahn and Meitner's work became public. 4 years of misinterpretation. 4 years when the world might have learned about fission earlier, might have pursued atomic weapons earlier, might have changed history's trajectory in ways we can only imagine. But there is another figure in this story whose prescience borders on the uncanny. Leo Szilard, the same physicist who would later drive through Long Island searching for Einstein, had been thinking about chain reactions since 1933. That year, Szilard was living in London, a Hungarian refugee watching Europe drift toward catastrophe. He had read an article by Ernest Rutherford, one of the great experimental physicists, who dismissed the possibility of extracting useful energy from atoms. Rutherford called such ideas moonshine, fantasy, impossible. Szilard took offence at this certainty. He was walking through London, waiting at a traffic light on Southampton Row, when the idea struck him fully formed. If you could find an element that emitted 2 neutrons when struck by 1 neutron, you could create a chain reaction. The neutrons would multiply, splitting atoms in a cascade that would release fantastic energy. It was September 12, 1933. The light changed from red to green. Szilard stepped off the curb carrying in his mind the theoretical basis for atomic bombs. He didn't know which element might work. He didn't know if any element would work. But he understood the principle, and the principle was enough. He filed a patent on the chain reaction concept assigning it to the British Admiralty to keep it secret. For 5 years, it remained an abstract possibility, a theoretical weapon with no practical path to realization. Then Hahn split uranium. Then Meitner calculated the energy released. Then physicists worldwide confirmed that fission produced excess neutrons. Szilard's traffic light revelation had become reality. The speed with which this knowledge spread is itself remarkable. In January of 1939, only a handful of scientists knew about fission. By June, more than 35 papers had been published in scientific journals spreading the discovery worldwide. No one had yet classified it as secret. No one had yet recognized that publishing these findings was equivalent to distributing a blueprint for unprecedented weapons. German physicists read about fission in German journals. Japanese physicists read about it in Japanese journals. Soviet physicists read about it in Soviet journals. American physicists read about it in American journals. Every major nation suddenly possessed the theoretical knowledge required to pursue atomic weapons. This may seem foolish in hindsight, this open publication of such dangerous knowledge, but consider the culture of science before the bomb. Physics was international, collaborative, built on the premise that knowledge should be shared freely. Discoveries published in Berlin would be read in New York, in Tokyo, in Moscow. Science advanced through this exchange, through building on each other's work without regard for borders. The idea that a physical discovery should be classified, should be kept secret from other scientists, was alien to most researchers. Even those who glimpsed the military implications struggled against their instinct to publish, to share, to contribute to humanity's collective understanding. But after those 35 papers, after the knowledge had spread everywhere, some scientists began to worry. Szilard tried to organize a voluntary publication ban, asking American physicists to stop publishing fission research. Some agreed, many did not. The French published anyway, the Germans published anyway. The cascade could not be stopped. By the time Einstein signed his letter to Roosevelt in August of 1939, the knowledge of fission had permeated the world's physics communities. The question was no longer whether atomic weapons were possible. The question was who would build them first. Meitner never worked on the bomb. She refused, despite her unparalleled understanding of nuclear physics. When offered the chance to join the British atomic program, she declined, absolutely. "I will have nothing to do with a bomb," she said. She had fled one horror in Germany. She would not contribute to creating another. Hahn remained in Germany throughout the war, working on reactor research but not on weapons. After the war ended, when he learned that atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he considered suicide. The discovery he had made, the experiment that had made his hands shake with its implications, had indeed led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1944 for discovering fission. Meitner, whose calculations had explained what Hahn's chemistry had revealed, was not included. This omission remains one of science's great injustices. Hahn's chemistry proved fission had occurred, but Meitner's physics explained what it meant and why it released such extraordinary energy. She lived to age 89, working in physics until her final years, always proud of the discovery but forever troubled by its consequences. Her gravestone bears an inscription chosen by her nephew Otto, Frisch, a physicist who never lost her humanity. Think about that phrase, a physicist who never lost her humanity. It speaks to something essential about the atomic age. The physics itself is neutral, neither moral nor immoral. It simply describes how matter behaves, how nuclei split, how energy releases. But the applications of that physics, the choices about what to build and what to destroy, those require humanity. Those require moral judgment beyond what equations can provide. Meitner made her choice. She would explain the atom but not weaponize it. She would teach physics but not build bombs. She would maintain her humanity even as others used her discovery to incinerate cities. The question that haunts me, that should haunt anyone who contemplates this history, is whether her choice mattered. The knowledge existed. Fission had been discovered. Whether Meitner participated or not, the bombs would be built. Her refusal changed nothing about the weapons themselves, only about her relationship to them. But perhaps that is precisely the point. Perhaps maintaining humanity in the face of inhumanity, refusing to participate even when your refusal is futile, matters in ways beyond immediate consequences. Perhaps Meitner's choice was less about stopping the bomb than about preserving something within herself that the bomb could not touch. The snowy path in Sweden, where she calculated 200 million electron volts per fission, exists still. The woods remain, indifferent to the history made there. If you walked that path today, you would find no marker, no memorial, just trees and snow and silence. But on that walk, in December of 1938, the world changed. A woman with an envelope and a pencil worked out the mathematics of atomic destruction. She saw clearly what it meant. She published the explanation so others would understand. And then she spent the rest of her life living with knowledge she could not unlearn, watching humanity wield forces she had helped reveal. When atoms learned to split, we learned something about ourselves. We learned that our curiosity would take us anywhere, regardless of danger. We learned that discovery precedes wisdom, that we unlock doors before we know what lies beyond them. We learned that knowledge, once gained, cannot be surrendered, only endured. Meitner knew this. Standing in Swedish snow, calculating devastation on paper, she knew that explaining fission would lead inevitably toward its weaponization. But she also knew that silence would not stop it. Hahn had already done the chemistry. Other physicists would soon replicate his work. The discovery was too simple, too accessible, too obvious, once you knew to look for it. So, she calculated. She explained. She published. And then she refused to build the bomb her explanation made possible. This is when atoms learn to split. Not when Hahn's chemistry proved it, not when laboratories worldwide confirmed it, but when Meitner walked through snow and understood what it meant, when she saw past the physics to the implications, when she glimpsed the future and chose her place in it. The atom had always been splittable. The forces binding nuclei together were powerful but not infinite. Nature had always permitted fission. We had simply not known how to ask the question correctly. But once we learned to ask, once we understood what uranium could do when struck by neutrons, the world became a different place. The atom's heart, which we had thought inviolable, proved vulnerable after all. And in that vulnerability lay power beyond anything our species had previously wielded. Meitner saw it first, calculated it first, understood it first, and carried that understanding for 50 more years, a burden that never lightened, knowledge that never lost its terrible weight. This is how atoms learn to split, through brilliant minds working at the edge of understanding, through experiments that revealed more than expected, through calculations on snowy paths that changed everything. And once learned, the knowledge could never be forgotten. Once understood, the physics could never be mysterious again. Once calculated, the 200 million electron volts could never be uncounted. The envelope on which Meitner wrote her calculations is lost to history. But the numbers remain, published and permanent, available to anyone who wants to understand how splitting one atom releases energy equivalent to burning millions of chemical bonds. We are all inheritors of that calculation now. We all live in the world Meitner's mathematics made visible. And whether we choose her path of refusal or some other path entirely, we cannot escape the fundamental truth she discovered on that winter walk. The atom can split. Energy can be released. Weapons can be built. And once that knowledge exists, it exists forever, awaiting those who would use it, haunting those who understand it, shaping the world whether we wish it to or not. While physicists published papers in scientific journals, another kind of knowledge was being gathered in darkness. Intelligence services across 3 continents were racing to answer a single question: who would build the atomic bomb first? The race was asymmetric, unbalanced by secrecy and deception. Each nation knew that others were pursuing the weapon, but none knew how far the others had progressed. In that uncertainty lay both danger and opportunity. A miscalculation could mean catastrophe. A successful deception could buy precious time. And in Germany, one man may have bought the world that time through calculations that were subtly, deliberately wrong. Werner Heisenberg was among the 20th century's greatest physicists. He had formulated the uncertainty principle, revolutionized quantum mechanics, won the Nobel Prize at age 31. When war came, he chose to remain in Germany, to lead the German atomic research program. This decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. Was Heisenberg a Nazi? The question resists simple answers. He was not a party member. He protected Jewish colleagues when he could, but he also served the regime, directing research that might have given Hitler atomic weapons. His motivations remain contested, debated, ultimately unknowable with certainty. What we do know is this: Heisenberg's calculations for how much uranium would be needed for a bomb were wrong, not slightly wrong, wrong by a factor of many times over. He told German officials that a critical mass would require tons of pure uranium-235, making the weapon impractical, impossible to build during wartime. The actual amount needed was far less. A sphere roughly the size of a grapefruit, weighing perhaps 50 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, could sustain a chain reaction. American scientists would prove this at Los Alamos. British scientists had estimated similar numbers in their MAUD report, but Heisenberg's calculations said tons. And based on those calculations, Germany never fully committed to building the bomb. Were these honest errors or calculated sabotage? After the war, Heisenberg claimed he had never wanted to give Hitler atomic weapons, that he had subtly steered the program away from success. His critics said he had simply failed, that his errors were genuine mistakes revealing the limits of German physics under the Nazi regime. We cannot know his heart, but we can observe the result. Germany never came close to building an atomic bomb, despite having some of the world's finest physicists, despite controlling uranium supplies, despite starting their program before any other nation. What Germany did pursue was heavy water. This requires explanation. To build a reactor that could breed plutonium, an alternative bomb material to uranium, you needed to slow neutrons down without absorbing them. Ordinary water absorbed too many neutrons, but heavy water, where hydrogen atoms contain an extra neutron, absorbed far fewer. The world's only industrial source of heavy water was the Norsk hydro plant at Vemork in Norway. A hydroelectric facility perched on a cliff above a deep gorge, it produced heavy water as a byproduct of fertilizer manufacturing. When Germany invaded Norway in 1940, they immediately secured this plant. Britain understood what this meant. If Germany was stockpiling heavy water, they were building reactors. If they were building reactors, they might be breeding plutonium. If they were breeding plutonium, they were pursuing the bomb. So Britain sent commandos to destroy it. The first attempt failed catastrophically. Gliders carrying British troops crashed in the Norwegian mountains. The survivors were captured and executed, but the mission had to succeed. The heavy water had to be stopped. In February of 1943, Norwegian commandos parachuted onto the frozen Hardanger Plateau. They skied through a winter storm to reach Vemork, descended the gorge in darkness, climbed the cliff face, cut through fences, and placed explosives in the basement where heavy water was stored. The explosion destroyed thousands of liters of heavy water and crippled production for months. Germany responded by ordering all remaining heavy water shipped back to Germany aboard a ferry crossing Lake Thyn. Norwegian resistance learned of this plan. They had one chance to stop it. A single operative, Knut Haukelid, snuck aboard the ferry the night before departure and placed a timed explosive in the bilge. The next morning the ferry departed with its cargo of heavy water. Passengers filled the deck. Ordinary Norwegians travelling between towns, unaware they were aboard a target. When the explosive detonated, the ferry sank rapidly in the deepest part of the lake. 14 civilians drowned alongside the heavy water Germany needed. Haukelid lived with that choice for the rest of his life. 14 deaths to prevent a Nazi atomic bomb. Was the exchange justified? He believed so, had to believe so, because the alternative was unthinkable. But the question admits no comfortable answer. The heavy water rests still at the bottom of Lake Thyn, 800 feet down, surrounded by the wreckage of a ferry and the bones of passengers who never knew why they died. Germany's nuclear program ended not with dramatic revelation, but with quiet capture. In April of 1945, as Allied forces swept through Germany, teams of scientists and intelligence officers raced to find German atomic facilities. They discovered reactors that had never achieved criticality. They found uranium ore but no enrichment capability. They found calculations and theories but no practical path to weapons. And they found the uranium itself. Germany's last hope for atomic weapons was being transported aboard submarine U-234, bound for Japan. When Germany surrendered, the submarine surfaced and surrendered to American forces. Its cargo of uranium oxide was seized. Hitler's atomic ambitions ended in the hold of a surrendering submarine, the uranium destined to be studied by the very scientists Germany had driven into exile. But while Germany's program faltered, Stalin's advanced in secret, accelerated by spies who penetrated the most secure facilities America had built. The Soviet Union began its atomic program in 1942, after intelligence reports confirmed that America and Britain were pursuing the bomb seriously. Stalin understood that the post-war world would be shaped by atomic weapons. He assigned the project to Lavrenti Beria, the head of the secret police, a man whose methods were brutal but effective. Soviet physicists were talented, their theoretical understanding profound, but they lacked crucial information about practical bomb design. How do you compress plutonium to achieve criticality? What configuration of explosives will create the necessary implosion? These were engineering, questions that required either extensive experimentation or access to someone else's solutions. Stalin got both. Klaus Fuchs was a German refugee physicist working at Los Alamos. He was also a communist and a Soviet spy. Fuchs had access to some of the Manhattan Project's most sensitive information. He knew about plutonium implosion designs. He knew about the Trinity test. He knew about the bombs being prepared for use against Japan, and he passed all of this to his Soviet handlers. The full extent of Fuchs's betrayal would not be discovered until 1950, but the damage was done years earlier. Soviet physicists received detailed information about bomb designs, while the Manhattan Project was still developing them. Stalin knew about the Trinity test before some American officials did. Soviet engineers studied American solutions and adapted them for their own program. This was not mere theft. Soviet scientists still had to build the infrastructure, enrich the uranium, breed the plutonium, conduct their own tests. But Fuchs's espionage saved them years of experimental dead ends. They could skip past errors America had already made, could focus resources on approaches that had proven successful. When the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in August of 1949, far earlier than American intelligence had predicted, Fuchs's information was a major reason why. The atomic monopoly America had assumed would last years, perhaps decades, lasted only 4 years. Fuchs was not alone. David Greenglass, an army machinist at Los Alamos, also passed information to the Soviets, recruited by his brother-in-law Julius Rosenberg. Theodore Hall, a brilliant young physicist, provided information independently. The Manhattan Project, for all its security measures, its compartmentalization, its restrictions, was deeply penetrated by Soviet intelligence. Why did they do it? Fuchs and Hall were ideological communists who believed the Soviet Union deserved atomic weapons as much as America. Greenglass was motivated partly by family loyalty, partly by payment, but the result was the same: secrets that cost billions to develop and employed 600,000 Americans were handed to Stalin for the price of a few clandestine meetings. Consider the moral complexity here. Fuchs believed that atomic weapons were too powerful for any one nation to monopolize. He saw himself not as a traitor, but as someone preventing American atomic dictatorship. From his perspective, sharing the secret maintained balance prevented one nation from holding the world hostage. History has judged him harshly, and perhaps rightly, but his reasoning reveals something important about the atomic age. The bomb created a new kind of geopolitics, where security through monopoly competed with security through balance. Fuchs chose balance, though the choice was not his to make. Across the Pacific, Japan pursued its own atomic program with characteristic determination and ultimate futility. Japanese physicists understood fission. They recognized its potential. But Japan lacked uranium, lacked electrical power for enrichment, lacked the industrial capacity to build what America and Britain were building. Japanese scientists searched for uranium in Korean mountains. They built cyclotrons to study nuclear physics. They calculated what would be needed for a bomb, and they concluded, correctly, that Japan could not build one before the war ended. The resources required exceeded what their embattled nation could provide. American bombers destroyed Japan's cyclotrons in the war's final months, ensuring that even theoretical research became impossible. When atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese physicists understood immediately what had happened. They had pursued the same goal, had understood the same physics. They had simply lacked the means to achieve it. But perhaps the most crucial intelligence of the entire war came not from spies or commandos, but from a single piece of paper carried out of occupied Denmark. Niels Bohr was Denmark's greatest physicist, a Nobel laureate who had trained many of the scientists now working on atomic programs across the world. When Germany occupied Denmark, Bohr remained, protected partly by his fame, partly by his non-Jewish parentage, but increasingly endangered by his outspoken opposition to Nazi racial policies. In 1943, Bohr learned he was about to be arrested. He escaped to Sweden in a fishing boat, then flew to Britain in a military aircraft, nearly dying when his oxygen supply failed at high altitude. From Britain, he travelled to America, where he joined the Manhattan Project as a consultant. But before he left Denmark, Bohr had received a visitor. Werner Heisenberg had travelled to Copenhagen, ostensibly for a scientific conference, but really to speak with his old mentor. What they discussed remains controversial. Heisenberg later claimed he was trying to establish that atomic bombs were impractical. Bohr remembered the conversation differently, as Heisenberg probing for information about Allied progress. What matters is what happened next. After Heisenberg left, Bohr made careful notes about German atomic research. He smuggled these notes to Britain in a creative way. He wrote them on a microdot embedded in a hollow key. But the key was lost or overlooked. The information never reached British intelligence. However, Bohr carried something else with him when he escaped: his knowledge of how little progress Germany had made. Heisenberg had revealed, perhaps inadvertently, that German scientists were still struggling with basic reactor physics. They had not solved critical mass calculations. They had not developed separation technology. They were years behind. This knowledge transformed Allied strategy. Before Bohr's information, Some British and American scientists feared Germany might be ahead in the atomic race. After Bohr's report, they knew Germany was behind. This certainty allowed them to focus on finishing their own bomb rather than worrying about a German weapon already built. The proof came in the most mundane way imaginable: a beer bottle label. Danish resistance fighters had obtained a bottle of heavy water from German-controlled Norwegian production. The bottle bore a Carlsberg brewery label, modified to indicate heavy water rather than beer. Analysis of the liquid revealed Germany's heavy water production levels. From those levels, British intelligence could estimate how far Germany had progressed with reactor research. A Carlsberg label revealing the status of Germany's atomic program. It sounds absurd, too trivial for such momentous stakes. But intelligence often works this way, through tiny clues accumulated and analyzed, through mundane details revealing strategic realities. By mid-1944, Allied intelligence was confident Germany would not produce an atomic bomb before the war ended. They were correct. When American teams finally entered German nuclear facilities, they found programs that had never come close to success. The race across 3 continents had produced a clear winner: America. Building on British research, driven by refugee scientists who understood what Hitler represented, supplied by Canadian uranium and European expertise, had developed atomic weapons, while other nations failed or fell too far behind. But the race had also revealed something troubling. Atomic knowledge could not be contained. Spies could steal years of research. Brilliant scientists could, given enough resources, replicate what others had achieved. The American monopoly was temporary, an artifact of wartime circumstances rather than permanent advantage. Stalin would have the bomb by 1949. Britain would test its own weapon by 1952. France would follow in 1960. China in 1964. The club of nuclear powers would grow inexorably, proving that scientific knowledge, once demonstrated, spreads beyond any one nation's ability to control. The commandos who sank heavy water in Norwegian lakes bought time. The intelligence services that tracked uranium shipments bought time. The spies who stole secrets compressed time. But all of them were working within a larger inevitability. Atomic weapons, once invented, would proliferate. The secret race across 3 continents was never about permanent victory. It was about who would get the bomb first, and what they would do with it, and whether that first possession would shape the post-war world enough to matter. Heisenberg's calculations, right or wrong, honest or sabotaged, kept the bomb from Hitler. Norwegian commandos ensured Germany never got the heavy water needed for plutonium production. Soviet spies ensured Stalin would not be far behind America. Japanese physicists proved that understanding physics was not enough without industrial capacity. And through it all, the knowledge spread. Each nation that pursued the bomb added to collective understanding. Each success and failure taught lessons to those who came after. The atomic age was beginning, and once begun, it could not be confined to a single nation, no matter how powerful, no matter how secretive. The race ended where it had to end, with mushroom clouds rising over deserts and cities, with the secret becoming public, with knowledge escaping every container built to hold it. We think of the atomic bomb as American because America built it first, but the bomb was never truly American, nor Soviet, nor British. It was human. A human discovery, drawing on international science, built by refugee scientists from a dozen nations, pursued by every major power simultaneously. The race across 3 continents proved this. While America ran fastest, others ran too. And once the finish line was crossed, once the bomb existed, the race transformed into something else entirely. A competition not to build the bomb, but to live with it, to control it, to prevent it from destroying everything we had built. That race continues still. In the mountains of New Mexico, on a mesa 7,000 feet above sea level, a city appeared where none had existed before. Los Alamos had been a boys' school, a quiet place where wealthy families sent their sons to learn Latin and ride horses in thin mountain air. In 1943, the government arrived with a proposition. We need your land, we cannot tell you why, and everyone must leave immediately. Within months, the school was gone, and something else was rising. Laboratories, housing blocks, machine shops, security fences topped with barbed wire, a post office that would become the busiest in New Mexico, handling mail for thousands of residents whose address was simply Post Office Box 1529, Santa Fe. The scientists arriving at Los Alamos were told only that they would work on an important war project. Many came because J. Robert Oppenheimer asked them personally. Oppenheimer had been appointed scientific director, and his reputation drew physicists from across America. They trusted him enough to accept positions without knowing what they would build. When they arrived and learned the truth, some were thrilled, others were troubled, but all understood they were attempting something that had never been done, transforming theoretical physics into practical weapons in less than 3 years. Los Alamos was not the only secret city. It was not even the largest. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, consumed 1/7 of America's entire electrical output by 1945. The town had not existed before the war. Now it sprawled across the valley, housing 75,000 workers who operated the machines that separated uranium-235 from uranium-238. This separation was monstrously difficult. The two isotopes were chemically identical, differing only by 3 neutrons in their nuclei. Those 3 neutrons changed the atomic weight by barely 1%. Separating them required exploiting that tiny mass difference through processes that consumed fantastic amounts of energy. Oak Ridge used multiple methods simultaneously. Gaseous diffusion pushed uranium hexafluoride gas through barriers with microscopic pores. The lighter uranium-235 molecules moved through slightly faster, creating enriched uranium after thousands of repetitions. Electromagnetic separation used massive magnets to curve uranium ions through magnetic fields, with lighter isotopes bending slightly more. Both processes were staggeringly inefficient. To produce 1 kilogram of weapons-grade uranium required processing tons of natural uranium through facilities the size of factories. The electricity required to run these plants could have powered entire cities. Instead, it powered the atomic program, operating 24 hours daily, consuming resources on a scale America had never attempted for any single project. The workers at Oak Ridge knew they were enriching uranium. Most did not know why. They operated control panels, monitored gauges, maintained equipment, and went home to hastily built houses in a city that appeared on no maps. Their mail was censored, their movements were restricted, they could not tell their families what they did, could barely discuss it among themselves, and still they came. 75,000 people working in secrecy, trusting that whatever they built mattered enough to justify the restrictions. Even more isolated was Hanford, Washington, where reactors bred plutonium along the Columbia River. Hanford's reactors were engineering marvels, the first large-scale nuclear reactors ever built. They bombarded uranium-238 with neutrons, converting some of it into plutonium-239, an element that barely existed in nature but made excellent bomb material. The reactors generated enormous heat. Columbia River water flowed through them for cooling, then returned to the river warmer and slightly radioactive. Fish populations changed. River temperatures rose measurably. Anyone paying attention could see something extraordinary was happening along that stretch of the Columbia, but few people lived nearby to notice. Hanford was deliberately remote, built in desert where security was easier, and accidents, if they occurred, would affect fewer people. Workers lived in temporary housing, worked long shifts, and knew even less than Oak Ridge employees about the project's ultimate purpose. 3 cities built in secrecy. Three different approaches to the same goal. Los Alamos designed the bombs, Oak Ridge enriched uranium, Hanford bred plutonium. Together, they employed more than 600,000 Americans, consumed resources equivalent to building thousands of conventional weapons, and cost roughly $2 billion at a time when the entire federal budget was measured in tens of billions. It was the largest scientific military project in human history, pursued with an urgency born from fear that Germany might finish first. At Los Alamos, life was surreal. Scientists worked alongside military personnel, theoretical physicists, collaborating with engineers and explosives experts. They held colloquia where anyone could question anything, scientific hierarchy flattened by the project's urgency. Oppenheimer encouraged this openness despite military resistance, believing the work was too complex for rigid compartmentalization. The result was a creative intensity unlike anything most scientists had experienced. Problems were solved through improvisation and collaboration. When they needed a particular calculation, Richard Feynman would work it out overnight. When they needed unusual materials, metallurgists would develop new techniques. When they faced seemingly insurmountable engineering challenges, they assembled teams that worked until solutions emerged. But there were costs. Scientists' families lived behind the security fence, isolated from the outside world. Children grew up calling each other by numbers rather than names, a security measure that turned humans into codes. Marriages strained under the pressure and secrecy. Some couples divorced. Some scientists drank heavily, unable to cope with the moral weight of what they were building. Oppenheimer himself was deteriorating. Chain-smoking, barely eating, he drove himself and everyone around him toward the bomb's completion. He quoted poetry, discussed philosophy, wrestled publicly with the implications of atomic weapons, even as he pushed relentlessly to build them. His contradictions mirrored the project itself, horrified by what they were creating, yet committed to finishing it. The technical challenges were immense. A uranium bomb was relatively straightforward. Shoot one piece of uranium into another, creating a critical mass that would explode. But plutonium was different. Plutonium bred in reactors contained small amounts of plutonium-240, which fissioned spontaneously and would cause premature detonation if a gun-type design was used. The solution was implosion. Surround a hollow sphere of plutonium with conventional explosives, detonate them simultaneously, compress the plutonium to twice its normal density, and achieve criticality through compression rather than assembly. Simple in concept, monstrously difficult in execution. The explosives had to detonate within microseconds of each other. The compression had to be perfectly symmetrical. Any irregularity would cause the plutonium to squirt out sideways rather than compressing uniformly. Months of work went into explosive lens design, into detonator timing, into understanding how shock waves travel through materials. They needed to test whether implosion would work. This required building a full-scale device and detonating it. The test would consume nearly all the plutonium Hanford had produced. If it failed, the Manhattan Project would lose months restarting plutonium production. But they had to know. Too much depended on certainty. In December of 1944, Enrico Fermi achieved something extraordinary beneath the University of Chicago's football stadium. While students studied in classrooms above, Fermi and his team assembled the world's first nuclear reactor. Graphite blocks and uranium slugs stacked into a precise configuration, with cadmium control rods that absorbed neutrons and regulated the reaction. On December 2nd, Fermi ordered the control rods slowly withdrawn. Neutron counters clicked faster as the reactor approached criticality. Fermi calculated the reaction rate using a slide rule, making adjustments based on his measurements. Finally, he announced, the reaction is self-sustaining. Humanity had achieved a controlled nuclear chain reaction. The pile, as they called it, though it was really a reactor, was generating power from fission, proving that atomic energy could be harnessed. More importantly for the weapons program, it proved that Hanford's reactors would work, that plutonium could be bred in quantities sufficient for bombs. Someone handed Fermi a bottle of Chianti. They drank in silence, everyone understanding they had crossed a threshold. Nuclear energy was no longer theoretical. The pile was modest, generating barely enough power to light a single bulb. But it proved the principle. Scale it up, and you could breed plutonium. Scale it further, and you could perhaps power cities, or destroy them. The scientists working on the Manhattan Project lived with constant moral ambiguity. Many were refugees who had fled European persecution. They understood viscerally what Hitler represented. Building the bomb to prevent a Nazi atomic weapon was not just strategic, it was existential. Yet as the work progressed, as Germany collapsed and surrender became inevitable, the justification became murkier. Some scientists began advocating for a demonstration rather than military use. Detonate a bomb over an uninhabited area, they argued, show Japan what America possessed, and allow surrender without mass casualties. Others insisted that only actual use would convince Japan's military government that further resistance was hopeless. Leo Szilard, who had started the atomic program with his letter to Roosevelt, now tried to stop the bomb's use. He drafted a petition signed by dozens of Manhattan Project scientists, urging that atomic weapons not be used against Japan without warning. The petition was classified, forwarded to Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and ultimately ignored. The scientists had created something they could no longer control. The bomb had become larger than any individual's moral qualms. It had momentum, institutional support, military necessity. It would be used because it existed, because $2 billion had been spent building it, because the logic of total war permitted any weapon that would end the conflict faster. Looking back, we can see the Manhattan Project as both triumph and tragedy, a triumph of scientific coordination, of theoretical physics transformed into engineering, of disparate facilities across America, working in concert toward a single goal, but also a tragedy, because that goal was weapons of unprecedented destructiveness, because success meant hundreds of thousands would die, because the scientists who built the bomb would carry that burden forever. The cities built from nothing, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, still exist. Los Alamos remains a national laboratory, still conducting nuclear research. Oak Ridge transitioned to other scientific work. Hanford became one of America's most contaminated nuclear sites, requiring billions for cleanup. But in 1943 through 1945, they were cities with a single purpose: building atomic weapons before anyone else. They succeeded. Whether that success was worth the cost, whether the weapons should have been built at all, whether the scientists should have refused to participate, these questions would admit no simple answers. What we know is this: 600,000 Americans worked in secrecy, lived behind security fences, accepted restrictions on their freedom, all to build 3 bombs. 2 would be dropped on Japan. 1 would be tested in New Mexico. And after those 3 bombs, the world would never be the same. The cities built from nothing gave birth to the atomic age. What they created cannot be uncreated. What they learned cannot be unlearned. And the consequences of their work continue decades later, still shaping geopolitics, still haunting those who understand what was built there. In mountains and deserts and river valleys, in places that appeared on no maps, America assembled the means to end the war, and to begin something else. Something we are still living with. Something that started with secret cities and consumed more resources than most nations possessed. The bomb was coming. The cities built from nothing ensured it would be an American bomb, built by American workers, deployed by American forces. But once built, once used, the bomb would belong to everyone. Its shadow would fall across the entire world. Those cities were where possibility became reality, where theory became metal and fire, where knowledge transformed into weapons. And once that transformation occurred, there was no path back to innocence, no way to forget what had been learned in secret cities built from nothing. The test site was called Trinity, named by Oppenheimer after a John Donne poem, "Batter my heart, three-personed God," an odd choice for the place where humanity would first unleash atomic fire. But Oppenheimer had a way of finding poetry in physics, of seeing in equations something more than mathematics. Trinity site lay in the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of Death, a stretch of New Mexico desert where Spanish conquistadors had once traveled between watering holes. In July of 1945, it became the stage for the most significant scientific experiment in human history. Before Trinity, before the full-scale test, there was a rehearsal. On May 7th, 1945, scientists detonated 100 tons of conventional explosives mixed with radioactive material. Not an atomic explosion, but a way to calibrate instruments, to understand blast effects, to practice measuring yields. Even this test produced a fireball visible for miles. Ranchers reported their windows shaking. Some wondered if a meteorite had struck. The military offered no explanation. The desert kept its secrets for a few weeks longer. But the 100-ton test proved something important. Implosion might work. The mathematics said it should work. The explosive lenses had been designed with extraordinary precision, but until metal and fire confirmed the theory, no one could be certain. The rehearsal showed that instruments would survive, that measurements could be taken, that the full test had a chance of succeeding. Still, there were doubts. Edward Teller worried that the explosion might ignite Earth's atmosphere. The nitrogen in air, he calculated, might undergo fusion reactions triggered by the bomb's heat. The entire atmosphere could burn in a runaway reaction, extinguishing all life on the planet. The concern was taken seriously enough that Hans Bethe and other physicists spent weeks calculating whether atmospheric ignition was possible. Their conclusion, extremely unlikely. The temperatures required were higher than the bomb would achieve. The reaction would not sustain itself. Earth's atmosphere would not burn, but extremely unlikely was not the same as impossible. And even a tiny probability of ending all life carried infinite weight. Some scientists made dark jokes about betting pools on whether Trinity would ignite the atmosphere. The jokes masked genuine anxiety. They were about to attempt something unprecedented, and no one could guarantee the outcome. Oppenheimer later said he chose poetry over equations during this period. The mathematics could not capture what Trinity meant. The implications exceeded what numbers could express. So he quoted the Bhagavad Gita, ancient Sanskrit verses about duty and destruction, finding in religious texts the language physics lacked. The device itself was called the gadget, a deliberately innocuous name for something that might reshape civilization. It sat atop a 100-foot steel tower in the desert, a metal sphere bristling with cables and detonators. Inside was a hollow sphere of plutonium surrounded by conventional explosives. When those explosives detonated simultaneously, they would compress the plutonium to critical density. Theory said this would work. Trinity would prove whether theory matched reality. The test was scheduled for July 16th, 1945, at 5:30 in the morning. The pre-dawn timing was deliberate. Darkness would make the flash more visible. Early morning meant less wind to spread radioactive fallout. And if the test failed catastrophically, fewer people would witness it. The night before, a thunderstorm rolled across the desert. Rain pelted the tower. Lightning struck nearby. Scientists huddled in bunkers 10 miles from ground zero, waiting for weather that would allow the test. Oppenheimer chain-smoked and worried. If lightning struck the tower, the gadget might detonate prematurely, or the conventional explosives might be ruined by water. Months of work could be destroyed by a storm. The rain continued past midnight. The test was delayed from 4 to 5:30. Meteorologists promised the weather would clear. Oppenheimer, exhausted and tense, had to trust them. Too much was invested to postpone. Too many people knew about Trinity now. Security depended on proceeding as planned. At 5 o'clock, the storm broke. Stars appeared through thinning clouds. The countdown began. Scientists at observation points put on welding goggles and turned away from ground zero. They had been instructed not to look directly at the explosion, to face away and watch the reflected light from nearby mountains. Even 10 miles distant, the flash might damage unprotected eyes. But Enrico Fermi had a different plan. He brought strips of paper, torn from a notebook. When the blast wave arrived, he would drop them and measure how far they travelled before falling to the ground. From that distance, he could calculate the explosion's yield. While others watched in awe or fear, Fermi would do physics. At -45 seconds, physicist Joseph McKibben activated automatic circuits that would trigger the detonation. The explosion would be initiated by timing devices too precise for human control. From this moment forward, Trinity would proceed independently, unstoppable by any human action. Oppenheimer watched from the control bunker, his face illuminated by instrument lights. He appeared calm, but those who knew him could see the tension. Everything he had worked toward for 3 years was about to be tested. If Trinity failed, if the implosion design was flawed, the Manhattan Project would need to start over. The war might end before an American atomic bomb was ready. At -10 seconds, a siren wailed across the desert. At -5 seconds, some scientists closed their eyes behind their goggles. At 0, the world changed. 5:29:45. The exact moment is recorded, preserved in documents and memories, and the collective consciousness of anyone who understands what happened that morning. Night became noon. That is how witnesses described it, and the phrase, though metaphorical, was literally true. The fireball's light was brighter than the midday sun, brighter than anything Earth had seen except the sun itself. It illuminated the desert for hundreds of square miles. Mountains 50 miles away cast shadows. The blind could see. Georgia Green was sleeping in Albuquerque, 120 miles from Trinity. She had been blind since birth, her world permanently dark. But at 5:29, she woke and called out that she had seen a brilliant flash of light. For a moment, Trinity's fire was so intense it penetrated even sightless eyes. The fireball expanded, swelling to nearly 2,000 feet in diameter in the first second. Its surface temperature exceeded the surface of the sun. Sand beneath the tower vaporized, then condensed as the fireball cooled, falling back to Earth as radioactive green glass. Scientists would later call this substance trinitite. It exists nowhere else on Earth, a mineral born from atomic fire. The mushroom cloud formed as hot gases rushed upward, drawing desert air behind them. It rose 7.5 miles into the stratosphere, its top spreading wider than the base, creating the distinctive shape that would become atomic weapons' signature. Radioactive debris spread through the cloud, to be carried by winds across New Mexico and beyond. At the observation point 10 miles away, the light arrived first. Scientists who had turned away saw their own bones through closed eyelids, X-rayed by the flash. Then came heat, a wave of warmth that could be felt even at that distance. Then, after nearly 30 seconds, the shock wave struck. The sound was unlike any natural thunder. It was sharper, more violent, a physical blow that knocked observers down. Windows shattered in buildings 50 miles away. The ground shook with seismic force, registering on instruments designed to detect earthquakes. Fermi dropped his paper scraps. He watched them flutter in the blast wind, measured the distance they travelled, did quick calculations. That was at least 10,000 tons, he announced. Later calculations would refine the yield to 22,000 tons of TNT equivalent. The first atomic explosion had been twice as powerful as the 100-ton rehearsal suggested. Oppenheimer watched the mushroom cloud rise and quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The phrase would follow him for the rest of his life, appearing in interviews and documentaries, becoming inseparable from Trinity itself. Whether he actually said it at that moment or only remembered thinking it later remains unclear, but it captured something essential about what had just occurred. Kenneth Bainbridge, the Trinity test director, was more direct. He turned to Oppenheimer and said, "Now we are all sons of bitches. No poetry, no ancient texts, just a blunt acknowledgement of what they had become. They had built a weapon that could incinerate cities. They had succeeded in their mission, and that success made them something new, something history had never seen, men who had given humanity the power to end itself." Not everyone was horrified. Some scientists cheered. The test had worked. 3 years of effort, $2 billion, 600,000 workers, all validated in a single flash. The physics was sound. The engineering was adequate. The bomb existed. But others were silent, stunned by the scale of what they had witnessed. The fireball had been viscerally wrong. Too bright, too hot, too powerful. The mushroom cloud rising into the stratosphere suggested forces beyond human control. They had started something that might not stop. Ranchers across New Mexico reported seeing the flash. Some thought it was the sun rising impossibly early. Others assumed military ammunition had exploded. The military issued a cover story. An ammunition dump had accidentally detonated. No danger to the public. Nothing to worry about. The story was widely disbelieved but officially accepted. The truth remained classified for months. When atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August, the world learned about nuclear weapons not from Trinity but from their use against Japan. Trinity remained secret, acknowledged only after the war when the government could no longer hide what thousands of New Mexico residents had witnessed. The tower that held the gadget had vaporized completely. Where it stood was a crater, shallow but wide, lined with trinitite. Radioactive debris covered the test site. Some areas would remain contaminated for decades, millennia, perhaps effectively forever. The half-life of some isotopes exceeded any meaningful human time span. Scientists returned to ground zero days after the test to measure radiation and collect samples. They wore no protective equipment beyond film badges that darkened with exposure. Many received doses that would later be considered dangerously high. Cancer rates among Trinity observers and nearby residents would eventually exceed normal levels, though proving causation remained difficult. The immediate question after Trinity was, what now? They had proved atomic weapons worked. Germany had already surrendered in May. Japan was collapsing but refused to capitulate. The bomb had been built to use against Germany. Should it now be used against Japan? Some scientists said yes. Japan's military government would never surrender without overwhelming force. Atomic bombs would shock them into capitulation, ending the war immediately and saving lives that a conventional invasion would cost. Others said no. Japan was already defeated, cut off from resources, unable to sustain its military. Demonstrate the bomb over Tokyo Bay, let them see what America possessed, and they would surrender without anyone dying from atomic fire. The debate never reached the scientists. The decision was political, military, made by people who saw the bomb as a weapon like any other weapon, only more powerful. Trinity had proved the bomb worked, therefore the bomb would be used. The logic was stark, simple, seemingly inevitable. 2 bombs were ready. Little Boy, a uranium gun-type device, would be dropped on Hiroshima. Fat Man, a plutonium, implosion device like the Trinity gadget, would be dropped on Nagasaki. Together they would kill hundreds of thousands and end the war. But on that July morning in the desert, the future remained uncertain. Trinity had just occurred. The mushroom cloud was still rising. Scientists were still processing what they had witnessed. The world beyond the test site did not yet know what had happened. In the desert silence after the shockwave passed, after the mushroom cloud had drifted east on prevailing winds, after the initial euphoria and horror had faded to exhaustion, the scientists at Trinity understood they had crossed a line. They had brought into existence something that could not be unmade. The knowledge was permanent. The weapon was real, and humanity would have to live with what they had created. Trinity's crater remains, fenced and monitored, open to visitors once yearly. The trinitite is protected, illegal to remove, though fragments escaped before the site was secured. You can hold pieces of Trinity in your hand, radioactive glass forged in atomic fire, physical evidence of the morning when physics became apocalypse. The tower is gone, vaporized. The gadget is gone, consumed in its own detonation. But the crater persists, a scar on the desert, marking the spot where dawn came early and too bright, where the atomic age began not with policy or politics, but with light and heat and a mushroom cloud that rose toward heaven. 5/29/45. The moment when everything changed, when theoretical physics became practical horror, when equations became fire, when humanity gained the power to destroy itself and proved that power was real. The terrible dawn had broken. There would be no returning to darkness. Einstein learned what his letter had wrought by radio, like millions of other Americans. August 6, 1945. The announcement was brief, matter-of-fact. An atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. Einstein's response was simple, shocked. Oh my God! He had known the bomb was being built. He had signed the letter that started the program. But knowing abstractly that weapons were possible was different from learning they had been used, that a city had been incinerated, that his equation had transformed from theory into mass death. For the rest of his life, Einstein called the letter his one great mistake. Not the equation itself that was simply truth, a description of how the universe works, but the decision to warn Roosevelt, to advocate for building the bomb, that was a choice, and choices have consequences. Yet what were the alternatives? If Einstein had remained silent, would Germany have obtained atomic weapons first? Would Hitler have hesitated to use them? Einstein had chosen what seemed like the lesser evil, America building the bomb to prevent Nazi Germany from building it alone. But choosing the lesser evil still meant choosing evil. This became the atomic age's fundamental dilemma. The bomb existed because brilliant people had built it, but they built it because they feared others would build it first. Each nation pursued weapons because other nations were pursuing them. The logic was circular, self-perpetuating, impossible to escape once it began. 3 days after Hiroshima, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered 6 days later. The war ended, and in ending, it inaugurated something new. A world where cities could be destroyed in seconds, where war threatened extinction rather than conquest, where security through strength meant possessing weapons that could end civilization. The scientists who had built the bomb reacted differently to its use. Some felt vindicated the weapon had ended the war, saved lives that a conventional invasion would have cost. Others felt horror at what they had created. Still others felt both simultaneously, pride and guilt, coexisting uneasily. Leo Szilard, who had started it all with his traffic light revelation and his letter through Einstein, tried to stop the bomb's use against Japan. He circulated a petition among Manhattan Project scientists, arguing for a demonstration rather than direct attack. The petition was ignored. After the war, Szilard largely abandoned physics for biology, as if changing fields could distance him from what physics had wrought. J. Robert Oppenheimer continued directing Los Alamos until 1945, then became an advocate for international control of atomic weapons. He argued that nations should place nuclear technology under United Nations supervision, that no single country should monopolize such power. His proposals went nowhere. Nations that possessed atomic weapons would not surrender them. Nations that lacked them worked to obtain them. In 1949, Oppenheimer opposed development of the hydrogen bomb, a fusion weapon far more powerful than fission bombs. He argued that such weapons served no military purpose, that their only function would be genocide. His opposition angered government officials and military leaders who saw the hydrogen bomb as necessary for maintaining American superiority over the Soviet Union. In 1954, Oppenheimer's security clearance was revoked after a hearing that resembled a trial. His past associations with communists, his opposition to the hydrogen bomb, his continuing influence over younger physicists, all were cited as reasons to remove him from classified work. The hearing was widely seen as retribution for his stance on nuclear policy. Oppenheimer never worked on weapons again. He spent his remaining years directing the Institute for Advanced Study, teaching, writing, giving lectures about science and society. But the shadow of the bomb never left him. Interviewers always asked about Trinity, about Hiroshima, about whether building the bomb had been right. His answers grew more nuanced over time, less certain, more troubled. In 1947, a group of atomic scientists created the Doomsday Clock, a symbolic timepiece measuring how close humanity was to self-destruction. They set it initially at 7 minutes to midnight, with midnight representing nuclear apocalypse. The clock would advance and retreat over subsequent decades as tensions rose and fell, treaties were signed and broken, weapons proliferated and were sometimes reduced. The clock was a powerful metaphor, capturing something essential about the atomic age. We were living on borrowed time, measuring our survival in minutes, always aware that midnight could come if the wrong decisions were made or the wrong accidents occurred. By 1952, both America and the Soviet Union had tested hydrogen bombs. These were not fission weapons like Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. They were fusion weapons, using fission bombs as triggers to ignite hydrogen fusion, the same reaction that powers the sun. The yields were measured not in thousands of tons but in millions of tons, megatons. The first American hydrogen bomb test, Castle Bravo in 1954, demonstrated the new weapon's terrifying power. Expected to yield 5 megatons, it actually produced 15 megatons, 3 times the prediction. The miscalculation had consequences. A Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon, was operating 85 miles from the test site, well outside the declared danger zone. When Castle Bravo detonated, radioactive fallout drifted over the boat. The crew saw the flash, felt the heat, watched white ash fall from the sky like snow. They collected samples, not understanding what they were touching. Within hours, the crew became ill. Radiation sickness developed over the following weeks. One crew member died. The rest survived but carried the effects of radiation exposure for the rest of their lives. The incident became an international scandal, revealing that hydrogen bomb tests endangered populations far beyond the immediate blast zone. Fallout became the atomic age's insidious legacy. Nuclear explosions lifted radioactive debris into the stratosphere, where winds carried it globally. Strontium-90, with a half-life of 29 years, fell with rain and accumulated in soil. Plants absorbed it. Animals ate the plants. Humans consumed the animals and milk products. Radioactive isotopes entered the food chain and settled in bones, where they would decay slowly, irradiating tissues for decades. By the late 1950s, traces of radioactive fallout could be detected in every living thing on Earth. Children born thousands of miles from any test site carried isotopes from bombs they had never seen. The atmosphere itself had become contaminated, a global commons poisoned by weapons testing. This realization drove the test ban movement. If atmospheric testing continued, radiation levels would rise indefinitely. Already, cancer rates were increasing in populations downwind from test sites. Pacific Islanders exposed to fallout suffered higher rates of thyroid disease and birth defects. American soldiers ordered to observe nuclear tests at close range were developing cancers at unusual frequencies. In 1963, after years of negotiation, the United States and Soviet Union signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, prohibiting nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in space, and underwater. Underground testing continued, but at least the global fallout problem would stabilize. The treaty was imperfect but significant, both superpowers agreeing that some limits on nuclear weapons were necessary for survival. But by then, the nuclear arsenals had grown to staggering size. At the peak in 1986, there were approximately 70,000 nuclear weapons worldwide. 70,000. Enough to destroy every major city on Earth multiple times over. Enough to create a nuclear winter if many were used simultaneously, with smoke blocking sunlight and causing global cooling that would devastate agriculture. The logic behind such arsenals was deterrence. If both sides possessed enough weapons to destroy each other completely, neither would dare attack. Mutual assured destruction MAD, an acronym that captured the strategy's essential insanity, peace through the threat of total annihilation, and remarkably, it worked. The United States and Soviet Union never fought directly. They waged proxy wars, competed economically and ideologically, built more weapons and larger delivery systems. But they never launched nuclear weapons at each other, never tested whether the deterrence doctrine would hold under the ultimate pressure, except once they nearly did. October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis. American reconnaissance revealed that Soviet missiles were being installed in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy demanded their removal. Khrushchev refused. For 13 days, the world held its breath while the superpowers moved closer to war. American forces went to DEFCON 2, one step below maximum readiness for nuclear war. Soviet submarines carrying nuclear torpedoes patrolled near Cuba. Each side maneuvered, threatened, calculated how far they could push without triggering catastrophe. On October 27, the crisis peaked. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. Another U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace. Soviet submarine B-59, surrounded by American warships dropping depth charges, prepared to fire a nuclear torpedo. Soviet protocol required 3 officers to authorize nuclear weapons use. 2 voted to fire. The third, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. One man, in a submarine under attack, said no. And because he said no, the torpedo was not fired, the crisis was resolved diplomatically, and nuclear war was averted. We know Arkhipov's name now, but for decades his decision remained classified. The world never knew how close it had come to nuclear war, or that a single officer's refusal had prevented it. This is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We survived by chance, by the presence of one calm man in a position to stop catastrophe. After Cuba, both superpowers stepped back from the abyss. The crisis had revealed how easily miscommunication and miscalculation could trigger war nobody wanted. A direct communication line, the hotline, was established between Washington and Moscow. Arms control negotiations became more serious. The recognition that both sides shared an interest in avoiding nuclear war became explicit policy. Treaties followed. The Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, limiting nuclear weapons to the 5 nations that already possessed them. the strategic arms limitation talks. In the 1970s, capping numbers of certain weapons, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, eliminating an entire class of missiles. Progress was slow, incomplete, constantly threatened by political changes and technological developments. But it was progress. The number of nuclear weapons declined from 70,000 at the peak to roughly 15,000 today. Still enough to destroy civilization, but fewer than before. Still too many, but moving in the right direction. Einstein did not live to see most of this. He died in 1955, a decade after Hiroshima, while the nuclear arms race was accelerating. His final years were spent advocating for peace, for international cooperation, for finding ways to eliminate nuclear weapons entirely. He never succeeded. The weapons remained, but his voice mattered. When Einstein spoke about nuclear dangers, the world listened. His fame, his moral authority, his association with the equation that made bombs possible, all gave his warnings special weight. He could not stop the arms race, but he could remind people that it was insane that survival required finding alternatives to nuclear threats. The letter Einstein signed in 1939 rests in the Roosevelt Library at Hyde Park. You can visit it, see his signature, read the warning about extremely powerful bombs. It sits behind glass, a historical document, a piece of paper that changed the world. Sometimes I wonder what Einstein thought when he looked at that letter in hindsight. Did he still believe signing it was a mistake? Or did he recognize that the choice was impossible, that every option carried catastrophic risks, that he had simply chosen one catastrophe over another? We cannot know. Einstein left writings about nuclear weapons, about his regrets, about his hopes for a world without bombs, but the complexity of his position resists simple summary. He signed the letter because he feared Hitler with the bomb. He regretted signing because Hiroshima showed what the bomb meant. Both positions were true simultaneously. This is the haunting aftermath of the atomic age. Everyone involved in creating nuclear weapons carries some burden of responsibility, but everyone also acted from understandable motives: fear of enemies, duty to country, commitment to ending war, desire to prevent worse outcomes. The scientists who built the bomb were not monsters. They were brilliant people facing impossible choices during a global catastrophe. Many spent their later lives advocating for nuclear disarmament, trying to undo what they had helped create. Some succeeded in reducing nuclear dangers. Others failed but tried anyway, and the weapons remain. 15,000 nuclear weapons, held by 9 countries, maintained and modernized, waiting in silos and submarines. We have lived with them for 80 years now. They have become part of the permanent landscape of international relations, a feature of reality we have learned to navigate without forgetting. The doomsday clock still ticks. Currently, it stands at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been. Climate change, artificial intelligence, biological weapons, and yes, still nuclear weapons, all threaten our continued existence. The atomic age inaugurated an era of existential risk that continues expanding, but we have not destroyed ourselves yet. 80 years after Hiroshima, civilization persists. We have had accidents, close calls, moments when disaster seemed imminent, and yet we continue. The bomb has not been used in war since 1945. This is simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring that restraint has held, terrifying that our survival depends on continued restraint indefinitely. Einstein's mistake, if it was a mistake, was believing that warning Roosevelt would prevent a greater evil. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps Nazi Germany with the bomb would have been worse than what actually occurred. Or perhaps his warning simply ensured the bomb was built sooner, by more nations, spreading faster than it would have otherwise. We cannot know. History offers no alternative timelines for comparison. We have only the world we actually inhabit, shaped by choices made in desperation and fear, by brilliance applied to destruction, by knowledge that could not be unlearned once gained. The haunting aftermath continues. We live with Einstein's legacy and Oppenheimer's burden and Meitner's refusal and Szilard's traffic light revelation. We live with the bomb, always aware it exists, usually able to ignore it, occasionally reminded when tensions rise that our world could end in minutes if the wrong decisions are made. This is the inheritance of the atomic age, knowledge we cannot forget, weapons we cannot eliminate, risks we cannot escape, and the eternal question: could we have chosen differently, or was the bomb inevitable once physics revealed the atom's secrets? The answer, like so much about nuclear weapons, resists certainty. We are left with doubt, with responsibility, with choices that seem necessary at the time but haunt us forever after. The atomic age began with Einstein's signature. It continues with our burden. And it will end only when we find wisdom equal to our knowledge, restraint equal to our power, cooperation equal to our capacity for destruction. Until then, we live in the aftermath, forever haunted by what we have built and cannot unbuild, forever measuring survival in minutes on a clock that never stops ticking. The letter sits in its archive, protected by glass and climate control. Einstein's signature remains clear, his handwriting distinctive even after 8 decades. Visitors file past, reading the warning about extremely powerful bombs, contemplating the moment when theoretical physics became practical horror. But the letter is just paper. The real inheritance of the atomic age exists elsewhere, in silos scattered across American plains, in submarines prowling beneath Arctic ice, in the calculations of military planners, and the nightmares of those who understand what nuclear war would mean. 15,000 nuclear weapons remain in the world today. The number has declined from the Cold War peak, but 15,000 is still 15,000, still enough to destroy every major city, still enough to create nuclear winter, still enough to end civilization as we know it. 9 nations possess these weapons now. The United States and Russia maintain thousands each, the legacy of Cold War arsenals that were never fully dismantled. Britain, France, and China possess hundreds. India and Pakistan maintain smaller arsenals pointed at each other across a disputed border. Israel maintains a policy of deliberate ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying possession. And North Korea has built perhaps 50 warheads, crude but functional, proof that even isolated nations with limited resources can join the nuclear club. This proliferation was not inevitable. The Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 attempted to limit nuclear weapons to the 5 nations that already possessed them. In exchange for not developing weapons, non-nuclear states were promised access to peaceful nuclear technology and a commitment from nuclear powers to eventually disarm. The treaty has been partially successful. Many nations that could have built nuclear weapons chose not to. South Africa built 6 weapons, then voluntarily dismantled them, the only nation ever to do so. Libya abandoned its nuclear program under international pressure. Brazil and Argentina, once pursuing weapons, instead signed agreements making South America a nuclear-free zone. But other nations ignored the treaty or withdrew from it. India tested nuclear weapons in 1974, then again in 1998. Pakistan followed within weeks. North Korea withdrew from the treaty in 2003 and conducted its first test in 2006. Iran's nuclear program remains controversial, with Western nations suspecting weapons development while Iran insists it pursues only peaceful applications. The spread of nuclear weapons reveals something troubling about international relations. Nations pursue the bomb not because they want to use it, but because others possess it. Security through deterrence only works if you have something to deter with. The logic that drove America and the Soviet Union to build arsenals now drives smaller nations to acquire their own weapons. North Korea's program demonstrates this clearly. A nation, isolated, economically, technologically backward in most areas, has nevertheless managed to build nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver them. Their mountain test site at Punggye-ri has been used 6 times, the final test in 2017 collapsing part of the mountain and releasing radioactive debris. Why does North Korea want nuclear weapons? Not to start a war, which they would lose catastrophically, but to prevent war, to ensure that no nation attempts regime change, to have leverage in negotiations. The bomb provides security that conventional forces cannot match. This is the same logic that drove the Soviet Union, that drives every nuclear power. The bomb guarantees survival, but it guarantees nothing else. North Korea remains impoverished, isolated, dependent on Chinese support. The weapons have not brought prosperity or international respect. They have brought only the certainty that North Korea will not be invaded, that it will survive as a state, that it will have something to bargain with. Iran presents a different case. Its nuclear program exists in a grey zone between peaceful and military applications. Enriching uranium for reactor fuel is legal under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Enriching it further to weapons grade is not. Iran has enriched uranium to levels close to weapons grade, maintaining that this is for civilian purposes while advancing capability that could be redirected toward weapons quickly. The international community responded with sanctions, negotiations, agreements, and renewed tensions. The 2015 nuclear deal temporarily limited Iran's program in exchange for sanctions relief. America withdrew from the deal in 2018. Iran responded by exceeding the deal's limitations. The cycle of pressure and response continues, with Iran perhaps months away from breakout capability if it chose to pursue weapons overtly. This is the new proliferation challenge. Not nations openly building bombs, but nations advancing technology that could become weapons quickly if circumstances changed. Japan has the technical capability to build nuclear weapons within months, but has chosen not to. South Korea and Germany similarly possess the knowledge and infrastructure but refrain from weaponization. For now, the question is, what happens if circumstances change? If North Korea's threats become more severe, might South Korea decide it needs its own deterrent? If China becomes more aggressive, might Japan reconsider its pacifist stance? If Russian aggression continues, might Germany pursue weapons despite its historical commitment to non-proliferation? These questions have no certain answers, but they reveal the fragility of the non-proliferation regime. Nations refrain from building weapons, partly from principle, partly from international pressure, and partly because the security environment allows restraint. Change the security environment, and the calculations change. Meanwhile, the original nuclear powers have not disarmed. The Non-Proliferation Treaty promised they would work toward complete nuclear disarmament. 80 years after Hiroshima, they maintain thousands of weapons. Russia and America have reduced their arsenals from Cold War peaks, but both have also modernized remaining weapons, investing hundreds of billions in new missiles, submarines, and warheads. This creates a moral problem. Nuclear powers tell other nations not to develop weapons while maintaining and improving their own arsenals. The hypocrisy is obvious. Why should Iran or North Korea accept permanent inferiority, while America and Russia reserve the right to weapons they claim others should not possess? The answer usually given is that established nuclear powers are responsible actors while proliferating states are not. But this reasoning is self-serving and historically dubious. America and the Soviet Union came terrifyingly close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. China and the Soviet Union had border conflicts while both possessed nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan have fought repeatedly despite both having the bomb. Nuclear powers are not inherently more responsible. They have simply possessed weapons longer. Yet complete disarmament faces enormous obstacles. Nations that possess nuclear weapons are reluctant to give them up, viewing them as ultimate guarantees of security. The verification challenges are immense. How do you ensure all weapons are dismantled and all materials accounted for? And the knowledge cannot be erased. Even if every weapon were destroyed, the physics remains known, the capability retained, the option to rebuild always present. This is why some argue the bomb is permanent, that we will live with nuclear weapons indefinitely. The knowledge cannot be forgotten, the logic of deterrence cannot be escaped, and international relations remain too conflictual for nations to trust completely in disarmament. But there is another side to the atomic legacy, one less discussed but equally important: nuclear technology's peaceful applications. Nuclear medicine has saved millions of lives. Radioactive isotopes enable cancer treatment through targeted radiation therapy. PET scans use radioactive tracers to detect diseases. Sterilization of medical equipment relies on radiation. The same physics that enables weapons also enables healing. Nuclear power generates about 10% of the world's electricity, more in some nations. France derives 70% of its power from nuclear reactors. As concerns about climate change intensify, nuclear energy gains renewed attention as a carbon-free power source that can operate continuously, unlike solar or wind. But nuclear power carries its own risks. Chernobyl in 1986 released radioactive contamination across Europe, killing dozens immediately and causing thousands of cancer deaths over subsequent decades. Fukushima in 2011 showed that even modern reactors in advanced nations can fail catastrophically during natural disasters. The question of nuclear waste disposal remains unresolved, with highly radioactive materials requiring secure storage for thousands of years. Space exploration depends on nuclear power. Plutonium-powered generators have enabled probes to explore the outer solar system, where sunlight is too weak for solar panels. Voyager spacecraft, launched in 1977, still function 45 years later, powered by plutonium that will decay for decades more. Plans for Mars missions include nuclear propulsion systems that could reduce travel time significantly. Nuclear fusion, the reaction that powers the sun, remains perpetually 20 years away from practical implementation, as it has been since research began in the 1950s. But recent advances in fusion research suggest it may finally become viable. If fusion power succeeds, it would provide nearly unlimited clean energy without the waste problems of fission reactors or the weapons proliferation concerns of uranium enrichment. These peaceful applications reveal something essential about atomic knowledge. It is not inherently destructive. The physics that enables bombs also enables healing, power generation, and space exploration. The choice between destruction and creation lies not in the knowledge itself, but in how we apply it. This brings us back to Einstein's question: should he have remained silent? If Einstein had refused to sign the letter, would the bomb have been built anyway? Almost certainly yes. Too many scientists knew about fission. Too many nations were pursuing weapons research. Einstein's letter accelerated American efforts, but silence would not have prevented the bomb. Would silence have given Hitler the bomb first? Possibly. Germany's program was poorly organized and based on flawed calculations, but circumstances could have been different. A few different decisions, a few scientists less conflicted, and Germany might have progressed further than it did. So Einstein's choice was not whether the bomb would exist, but who would build it first. He chose to ensure America built it first, hoping democratic nations would use such power more responsibly than fascist ones. History suggests he was correct. America used the bomb twice, killing hundreds of thousands. But Hitler, with atomic weapons at his disposal while losing the war, might have used them more extensively, more indiscriminately, with less restraint. Still, the question haunts. The world Einstein helped create is one where nuclear weapons remain, where proliferation continues, where the risk of catastrophic war persists. Would silence have been better? We cannot know. But we can observe that the atomic age has now lasted 80 years without nuclear weapons being used in war since Nagasaki. This is longer than anyone in 1945 would have predicted. Perhaps the bomb's very terribleness has prevented its use. Perhaps mutual assured destruction, for all its insanity, has worked. Perhaps humanity has learned enough from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to never repeat that horror. Or perhaps we have simply been lucky, and luck will eventually run out. The original letter rests in its archive. The scientists who wrote it and those who built the weapons it described are all dead now, but their legacy continues. We are still living with the atom, still wrestling with knowledge that cannot be unlearned, still trying to prevent weapons that could end civilization from being used. Future generations will face these questions too. New technologies will create new risks. Artificial intelligence may become as consequential as nuclear weapons. Biotechnology could enable engineered pandemics. Climate change threatens disruption that could destabilize the international cooperation needed to prevent nuclear war. But we have one advantage that Einstein's generation lacked: experience. We know what nuclear weapons do. We have seen mushroom clouds. We have measured fallout. We have studied the effects on Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. We have lived through the Cold War and emerged without destroying ourselves. We have evidence that restraint is possible, that humans can possess terrible weapons without using them. This experience matters. It informs policy, shapes treaties, motivates disarmament efforts. It reminds each generation that the bomb is not theoretical, not abstract, but terribly real. And that reality, paradoxically, may be what saves us. The bomb's existence makes its use unthinkable, and as long as it remains unthinkable, we might continue surviving. Einstein's signature launched the atomic age, but every person since then has participated in what the atomic age becomes: scientists who build or refuse to build weapons, politicians who negotiate treaties or escalate tensions, citizens who demand disarmament or accept nuclear deterrence. Each generation chooses whether to move toward or away from the precipice. We are still choosing. The doomsday clock still measures minutes to midnight. The weapons still exist in their silos and submarines. The knowledge remains in textbooks and the minds of scientists. The choice between destruction and creation, between extinction and survival, between wisdom and folly, these remain before us. Forever living with the atom means forever making these choices. The burden Einstein carried, the guilt Oppenheimer felt, the refusal Meitner demonstrated, all of these responses to atomic knowledge remain available to us. We can build or refuse to build. We can threaten or negotiate. We can proliferate or disarm. The letter in the archive cannot tell us which path to take. It can only remind us that our choices matter, that knowledge carries responsibility, that what we create we must live with. Einstein signed knowing the consequences could be terrible. He was right, but he also hoped that awareness of those consequences would lead humanity toward wisdom. That hope persists. 80 years into the atomic age, we have not destroyed ourselves. The weapons exist, the knowledge remains, the risks continue, but we continue too. Still learning, still choosing, still trying to find ways to live with the atom without letting it end us. This is Einstein's legacy, and ours. Not just the bomb, but the choice about what to do with it. Not just the knowledge, but the wisdom to wield it carefully. Not just the power to destroy, but the restraint to survive. The atomic age began with a signature on a summer afternoon. It continues with our choices every day, and it will end only when we decide what ending means: extinction or wisdom, catastrophe or survival. The midnight of the doomsday clock, or a new dawn where the atom serves life rather than threatening it. We are still living with the atom. The question is whether we can live with it forever, or whether eventually, inevitably, midnight will come. The letter cannot answer that. Only we can. Only through the choices we make, the treaties we sign, the weapons we build or dismantle, the wisdom we apply or ignore. Einstein's signature started something that cannot be stopped, but it can be shaped, guided, perhaps eventually transcended. This is our burden and our opportunity, to live with the atom forever, and to make that forever mean survival rather than extinction. The story continues. We are writing it still.